All right, good afternoon, class. This is John checking back in, and I promise I'm going to try to put some finishing touches on the story we've been trying to tell, the history we've been trying to present over the last couple days, which is really focused upon a critical moment in Congolese history that occurred in 1960 with the really close encounter that the Congolese people had with true independence. And as you could probably tell in my comments, they did not go particularly smoothly. Independence proved fleeting, but the way in which independence failed tells us a lot about our, what we have been focusing on this past unit, looking at the role of commodities in conflict. And I think we can make a fairly clear case that the commodities that that existed in abundance and still exist in abundance in the Democratic Republic of Congo today have played a critical role in instability and obstacles to development, obstacles to effective political sovereignty and control. And so I've been clicking here, trying to move us ahead to look at the points that I reinforced today. There were a few of you who weren't in class today, so I'm clicking along at a rate. You can feel free to pause and take down these notes if you so choose. But we left off today with these questions, I guess more theories that have been put forward for why the Belgian government was willing to let independence in the Congo proceed as quickly, swiftly, and suddenly as it did. And so there's a few different lines of thinking on that. But I want to get into new terrain here so I can hopefully come really close to finishing. And Patrice Lumumba, we ought to know by now, is an absolutely central player in this important chapter in the Congo's history. And I mentioned in class today that he was not necessarily an ambitious political leader. In some ways, he was thrust into circumstances, in an unpredictable manner, but clearly a critical moment in his trajectory as an independence leader and the future prime minister, if only for a brief several weeks in the early Congolese independence period. This was the product of circumstances. And on Independence Day, June 30th, 1960, there was a special ceremony called into being, and it was an odd ceremony to say the least. The outgoing Belgian government and the king, who is shown here on the right, seated in the chair in the white suit, gave an interesting speech where he essentially praised the role of Belgium and sort of gave himself and his native Belgian country of Belgium a standing ovation for how well it had essentially prepared and situated the Congolese people for their future. And those who were in attendance, particularly the native Congolese, people like Patrice Lumumba, Joseph Kasavubu, and others, were somewhat stunned and even speechless in response, with the exception of Patrice Lumumba. After Kasavubu gave a very sort of quiet, subdued, prepared statement that was obsequious, meaning he sort of bowed to the power of the Belgian state. Patrice Lumumba took the podium and, as you can see here, spoke some pretty forceful words. What's remarkable is that he wasn't expected to speak at all, and I don't know that he was particularly planning on speaking, but he clearly was prepared for a number of different possibilities, and when the moment presented itself, he was willing to step up and speak his mind. And as you can see in these words, they are certainly not appreciative. They are not praising or thanking the nation of Belgium for its period of colonial power. This is a pretty strong indictment, although I would argue probably pretty honest and well-deserved indictment that the Congolese were giving to their Belgian colonizers. But this is a critical moment because it sort of sets the stage for the coming weeks, months, and years of Congolese independence. And of course, it's one of those moments where things are not ever the same afterwards. So this is a watershed moment, this speech that Patrice Lumumba delivers, because it makes it clear that Lumumba is a political leader who's not afraid to speak truth to power. He's not interested in pandering to the powerful interests that still continue to operate within the former Belgian colony. The king was insulted. He said as much and communicated as much. And if you'll recall from our earlier conversation about the sort of fault lines that existed within the then Belgian colony of the Congo, we know that the part in Elizabethville in the province of Katanga, where the Kanakot political association exists under Moise Tshombe, that there's going to be a reaction. And this is a moment where the Congo really falls squarely onto the radar of the United States and the West, because this is also in the backdrop of a Cold War concern about the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, and the U.S. starts to become nervous that perhaps this newly decolonized Congo is going to be a little bit of a difficult, unknown quantity to deal with within the larger scheme of things. So here we have Moise Tshombe. We've already met him. He speaks and represents fairly firmly the mineral resource industry, and that, of course, is where he hails from in the province of Katanga. And he speaks, there's up until this moment, centuries and decades of foreign investment has been poured into the development of the Congo's resource extraction industry. And Tshombe becomes essentially a figurehead who's willing to advocate for the interests that have these mineral resource concerns. He's educated in a missionary school, which shouldn't come as a big surprise. We talked about that earlier. That reflects some of the politics that he would have had by virtue of coming from that background. He had been to a recent conference in Brussels, Belgium, where he was in communication with some of the colonial powers, and it's quite possible that there was some planning, contingency planning, for what might happen when the Congo became formally independent. And his position on things was to create as loose of a political federation for the new nation of Congo as possible, by and large to create and maintain the possibility that the region of Katanga and its mineral resource wealth could in fact choose an independent and separate path if that became necessary. Tshombe also controlled a mercenary army, so a privately operating army that never fully disbanded, even when the Belgians left. It was largely staffed by Belgian officers and funded by the mining conglomerate, the Union Minière, Haut Katanga. So in some ways, what's interesting here is it's like as the Congo is moving into independence, it's never, the Belgians are not fully relinquishing or loosening their grip upon this new independent decolonized region. And that's a big part of the problem. So there's also these concerns. Of course, the post-war Soviet Union, post-war meaning post-World War II, the Soviet Union has an interest because much of sub-Saharan Africa is what would be called the non-aligned parts of the world. I talked about first world, second world, and third world countries. Well, these were the third world countries, meaning they had not yet chosen with whom they would align, the United States or the Soviet Union. In this simplified ideology of the Cold War, it was expected that you were either with us or against us. There wasn't much latitude or room left for countries to just not be aligned. The assumption was by the Soviet Union and the United States that a country was aligned. It was just a question of with whom. And so the Soviet Union is working hard to sort of create bonds and ties to Congo, hoping that it will become aligned with the quote-unquote second world. And they saw this brave, courageous act by Patrice Lumumba as a possible, this speech as a possible opening whereby the Soviet Union could connect itself or hitch itself closely to the fate and the future of the Congo. In the United States, by contrast, there's a threat to the capitalist and capital investments that Western mining companies and other multinational corporations interest that they had in the Congo. And so there's that paired with this ideological concern that perhaps the Congo will go the Soviet way. So the U.S. State Department, our Central Intelligence Agency, they all get involved. And in the aftermath of Lumumba's speech, they start even trying to manipulate and change events inside of the Congo. Almost immediately upon independence, the army mutinied, so this was a real concern. It meant that Lumumba and his administration were going to be facing the future with a major asset, a major source of power and control, no longer under their control. A lot of the native Congolese erupted at this moment, and there was a rash of violence and riotous outbreaks, a number of crimes, assaults. There were widespread instances of rape, theft, destruction of property, so on and so forth, such that the settlers, these Belgo-Congolese, the civil servant class, launched an exodus for fear of their own lives and safety. And it's about this time in late 1960 that Katanga formally secedes for a time, and that of course was something that Lumumba was very upset about. Belgium acts somewhat surprised by these circumstances and leans heavily on Patrice Lumumba to try to restore order. It's widely believed that the Belgians knew that this would be difficult, especially with a military that had mutinied upon him, but it was a way of creating political pressure to suggest that he was not in control of his newly independent country. Lumumba, for his part, appeals to many authorities outside of the Congo, the United Nations, the United States, neighbors to the Congo, and even the Soviet Union. And it's in this last respect that the international community starts to fear, or uses this as their basis for fearing, that Lumumba has aspirations to take the Congo in a communist direction. I'll conclude here. I don't have much time, so I'm going to be rather quick here. The United Nations does decide to intervene, so from 1960 to 64 that'll be the case. But the United States government, this is now the Kennedy administration, creates fairly strong connections, cultivates a relationship with Mobutu, who was an officer, military officer, and I think he was a early chief of staff to the Patrice Lumumba leadership team. Anyway, he's going to be a workaround that the United States uses. Lumumba will ultimately be arrested and then put to death in the fall of 1960, and this creates a whole host